The attorney looked at me across the conference table and said, with a kind of practiced sympathy that felt almost rehearsed, that my father's estate was more complicated than anyone had anticipated. He said it like I should feel sorry for him. I nodded. I didn't say anything. I had learned a long time ago that silence makes people uncomfortable enough to keep talking. He kept talking. My name is Brooke, and I want to tell you about the day my family stood in front of a judge and called me a burden. Not in private, not in a whispered argument at Thanksgiving dinner. In a courtroom with a court reporter typing every word and a federal judge looking down from the bench. But I should back up. My father passed away in February. It was a Tuesday, and I found out through a text from my aunt, not even a phone call. Just, your dad passed this morning. Funeral is Saturday, that was it. No, I'm sorry, no. Are you okay? Just logistics. I drove 14 hours from Virginia to get there in time. I didn't sleep. I stopped once for gas outside of Knoxville and stood in the parking lot for a few minutes, watching the highway, trying to feel something that made sense. My dad and I hadn't spoken much in the last few years. That was complicated. Everything about my family was complicated. The funeral was at a small Baptist church outside of Lexington, Kentucky. The town my father grew up in, the town I grew up in until I was 12. The town I had quietly put in my rearview mirror and never really looked back at. White clapboard siding, red doors, crepe myrtle trees lining the parking lot that were just starting to bud, even though it was still cold. My brother was there, my stepmother, my aunt and her husband, a few cousins I hadn't seen since I was a teenager. Nobody hugged me when I walked in. My stepmother. I'll just call her that because that's what she was legally, even if she never acted like any kind of mother to me. She looked up when I came through the door and then looked away. Like I was someone she vaguely recognized from the neighborhood. Not her husband's daughter. Not someone who had driven through the night to be there. My brother nodded at me from across the room. That was the entirety of our greeting. I found a seat near the back and I sat down, and I folded my hands in my lap, and I listened to the pastor talk about my father like he knew him. Maybe he did. I didn't say anything. The will reading was 3 days later. My father had a lawyer, a man named Sutton, older, with the kind of mustache that went out of style somewhere around 1987, and apparently nobody told him. He gathered us all in his office, which smelled like old carpet and printer toner, and he read through the document in a flat monotone. My stepmother got the house. My brother got the business, a small landscaping company my dad had built over 30 years. There were some retirement accounts, some personal property, a truck. And then Sutton cleared his throat and said there was one more item. A parcel of land. 42 acres out on Route 9, mostly wooded, with a small creek running along the back edge of it. My grandfather had left it to my dad. My dad apparently had left it to me. The room went very quiet. My stepmother turned and looked at me. Not with grief, not even with surprise. With something that looked like fury that she was trying very hard to keep civil. My brother said, "That has to be a mistake." Sutton said it was not a mistake. My stepmother said she needed to speak to her own attorney. I sat there with my hands in my lap and I didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that would have helped, and I already knew, in the way you know things when you've grown up inside a particular kind of family dynamic, that this was not over. It took them 6 weeks to file the lawsuit. The claim was that my father had not been of sound mind when he updated his will 18 months before his death. They had a doctor's note, a vague one, from a general practitioner who had treated my father for blood pressure and knee pain, suggesting he had experienced some cognitive changes in his later years. They had my stepmother's testimony. They had my brother's. What they did not have was any actual evidence. What they did have was a story. And the story was this: that I had been absent, that I had abandoned my family, that I had moved away and barely called and certainly never came home for holidays, and that my father, in some weakened and confused state, had been manipulated or guilt-tripped into leaving me property that should rightfully belong to the people who had actually been there. That was the word they kept using in the filings. Present. As in, I had not been present. As in, presence was the measure of worthiness. I read those filings at my kitchen table in Virginia with a cup of coffee that went cold, and I thought about what it meant to be present, whether presence was physical, Whether it was the kind of thing that could be measured by how often you showed up at Sunday dinners, or whether you made it home for Christmas. I thought about the last 3 years of my life, about where I had been and what I had been doing and why I hadn't been able to explain it to my family even when I wanted to. I didn't call a lawyer right away. I thought about it for 2 days. Then I called my friend Cassie, who had gone to law school and now worked for a firm in DC, and I told her what was happening. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I loved about her. When I finished, she said, "Brooke, you need to get someone local, someone who knows Kentucky property law. But I also need to ask you something." I said, "Okay." She said, "Is there anything they don't know about you? About your work? About what you've been doing?" I said there were some things. She said, "Okay, then you need to tell your attorney everything, even the things you'd rather keep quiet, especially those." The attorney I hired was a woman named Frances, who had an office above a hardware store in downtown Lexington and a reputation for winning cases that looked unwinnable. She wore her reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she had the habit of looking at you over the tops of them when she thought you were being evasive. She looked at me over the tops of them a lot in our first meeting. I told her about the land, about the will, about the lawsuit, about my family. Then she said, "Tell me about your work." So I did. I told her about the last 7 years, about the job I had taken at 24, right out of graduate school, and what it actually involved and why I had signed documents that meant I couldn't discuss the specifics with my family. Why, when my stepmother asked me at my dad's 60th birthday party what exactly I did for the government, I had smiled and said I worked in research and changed the subject. Frances took off her reading glasses and set them on the desk in front of her and looked at me for a long moment. "So your family genuinely doesn't know?" she said. "No," I said. "And you can't tell them." "There are things I can verify through official channels," I said. "Credentials, clearance level, certain commendations. But the specific work, no, not without authorization." She picked up her pen. "All right," she said. "Then we're going to let the other side talk first." The hearing was on a Thursday in April. The courthouse in Lexington was old and solid, built from limestone, the kind of building that made you feel the weight of what was happening inside it. I wore a gray blazer and low heels. I sat at the table with Frances, and I folded my hands in front of me and I waited. My stepmother and brother were at the table across the aisle. Their attorney was a man I'll call Preston, younger than Frances, confident in the particular way that comes from winning enough times to stop fully preparing. He had a smooth voice and a way of pausing that suggested he expected people to nod along. He called my stepmother first. She talked about my father's last years, about how his memory had slipped, about how I had barely visited, had barely called, about how she had been the one to take him to his appointments, to manage his medications, to sit with him when he was frightened at night. Some of that was probably true. I didn't object to any of it. I sat and listened. Then Preston called my brother. My brother talked about presents again, about how I had missed holidays, missed his kids' birthdays, missed my father's retirement party, how I had called maybe once a month at best, how when he asked me what I did for work, I gave vague non-answers that made everyone in the family feel like I thought I was better than them. He said, "Honestly, she was never really part of this family. Not after she left. She just showed up when there was something to get." I looked at the table in front of me. I kept my breathing even. The judge, her name was the Honorable Catherine Marsh, and she had the kind of quiet authority that didn't need volume. She had been writing notes throughout. She looked up when my brother said that. She looked at me. I didn't change my expression. Then Preston made a small speech about the nature of familial obligation, about cognitive vulnerability in older adults, about how the law was designed to protect people from being taken advantage of in weakened states. Frances didn't object to most of it. She had told me she wouldn't. She had told me to trust her. I trusted her. When it was Frances's turn, she stood up and said she had only a few items to submit to the court. She didn't call me to testify. She called no witnesses at all. She simply walked to the judge's bench and handed up a folder. Judge Marsh opened it. The courtroom was quiet, just the sound of papers. Preston watching. My stepmother watching. My brother watching me, like he was waiting for me to look nervous. I didn't look nervous. I looked at a spot on the wall just above the judge's head, and I breathed. Judge Marsh read for what felt like a long time. Then she closed the folder. She looked at Preston. She said, "Counselor, are you aware of your opposing party's professional background?" Preston said with full confidence that he was. That she was a government researcher of some kind. That the vagueness around her employment was itself somewhat telling. The judge said, "I see." She opened the folder again and slid one page toward the edge of her bench, toward him. "Would you like to review this before you continue?" Preston walked up. He took the page. He read it. I watched his posture change. It was subtle. A slight stiffening, a recalibration happening somewhere behind his eyes. He said, "I wasn't aware of the full scope." Judge Marsh said, "No, I didn't imagine you were." She looked at my stepmother and brother. My stepmother had leaned forward, trying to read Preston's expression. My brother had his arms crossed, but the certainty in his face had shifted into something more uncertain. The judge set the folder down carefully. She said, "I want to speak plainly. This court has reviewed the documentation provided regarding the testator's mental competency assessments, and I find the evidence of cognitive impairment to be insufficient to invalidate the will as written. Furthermore," she paused briefly, "having now reviewed the professional record of the respondent, I find the characterization of her as an absent and uninvested family member to be significantly incomplete." She looked at Preston again. "Your clients may not have had access to the information in this record, but I would encourage you, going forward, to conduct more thorough research before suggesting in open court that someone who has served in the capacity documented here was simply absent. That word requires some context." The room was very quiet. My brother said, not to anyone in particular, not really meaning to speak out loud, "What does that mean? What's in there?" The judge did not answer him. She had already moved on to her ruling. We walked out into the April sunshine, and Frances put her hand briefly on my shoulder and said, "Well done." I said I hadn't done anything. She said, "You stayed quiet when most people couldn't have." I stood on the courthouse steps for a minute. The crepe myrtles and the planters along the street were blooming, the same pale pink as the ones at that church in February. I thought about my father, about the 42 acres with the creek along the back edge, about what I was going to do with it. I hadn't decided yet. My stepmother called me that evening. I almost didn't answer. I stood in my hotel room and watched my phone buzz on the nightstand, her name on the screen, and I thought about all the versions of that conversation and how most of them went. I answered. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know. About your work." I said, "I know." She said, "Your brother didn't know either." I said, "I know that too." Another silence. Then she said in a different voice, smaller, less certain, "Was it because of us that you didn't tell us?" That was a harder question than she probably realized she was asking. The honest answer was, not entirely. Mostly it was the nature of the work itself, the clearances, the agreements I'd signed. But some of it, a small honest part of it, was that I hadn't trusted them with something that vulnerable. I hadn't trusted them to see the real version of my life and not diminish it somehow. I didn't say all of that. I said, it was complicated. The work made it complicated. She said, "Are you safe? Doing what you do?" I said, "Mostly." She made a sound that might have been a small laugh or might have been something else. She said, "I think your father knew more than he let on. He was proud of you. He didn't always know how to say it." I sat down on the edge of the hotel bed. The ceiling had a water stain shaped like nothing in particular. I looked at it for a while. I said, "I know." We talked for another 20 minutes. Not about the lawsuit, not about the land, about my father. About a road trip he had taken us on when I was 8, just me and my brother, up through Mammoth Cave and then north to Cincinnati to see a Reds game. How he had gotten us completely lost on the way back, and somehow that had been the best part of the whole trip. The three of us in his old pickup with the paper map spread out on the dashboard. My brother navigating confidently in entirely the wrong direction. My dad laughing until his eyes watered. I had not thought about that trip in years. When I hung up, I sat there for a long time. My brother called the next morning. He didn't apologize exactly. He said something like, "I said some things in there that I shouldn't have said the way I said them," which, for him, was significant. I said I appreciated that. He said, I still don't fully understand what you do. I said, I know. He said, are you doing something that matters? I thought about the last 7 years. About the specific projects I couldn't name. About the times I had been in situations I couldn't describe to anyone who hadn't signed the same documents I had. About the people whose names I knew and whose safety had, in small or large ways, been connected to work I had done in rooms that didn't officially exist. I said, yes, I think so. He was quiet. Then he said, okay. And I could hear something shift in him too, the same recalibration that had happened in Preston's posture, but slower and more genuine. Okay, that's okay. We didn't suddenly become close. It wasn't like that. There wasn't a single conversation that undid years of distance. But something was different. The particular shape of the silence between us changed. I drove out to the property before I left Kentucky. 42 acres, mostly second-growth forest. A gravel road leading in from the highway that had gone soft with winter and was just starting to firm back up. I parked where the road ended and I walked into the trees. The creek was exactly where the property records said it was, narrow, fast-moving, clear. Limestone outcroppings along the bank, ash trees and oaks, and somewhere above me 2 woodpeckers arguing over the same dead trunk. I stood next to the water and I thought about my grandfather, who had bought this land in the 1960s with money saved over a decade of working double shifts at a factory in Louisville, who had walked these same trees and listened to the same creek and believed, in the straightforward way of that generation, that what you put your hands on and paid for with your labor became something you could pass down. He had passed it to my father. My father had passed it to me. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it. Maybe nothing for a while. Maybe I would build something small someday, a place to come back to. Maybe I would just let it be what it was. I stayed for a long time until the light started to change and the creek went from clear to something darker and more amber-colored, and the woodpeckers finally stopped arguing, and the woods went quiet. Then I walked back to my car and I drove back toward the highway, and I headed north, and I started the long drive home. I keep thinking about that moment when Preston walked up to the bench and took that single page from the judge's hand. The way his posture changed. That small, almost invisible recalibration, like something he had been certain about had just quietly come apart. I wasn't angry watching it happen. I think I expected to feel something sharper. But mostly I just felt tired and a little sad and strangely grateful that I had chosen to stay quiet for as long as I did. Here's what I've come to understand about the years my family spent not knowing who I was. The not knowing was never really about information. My brother knew how to pick up the phone. My stepmother knew my address. What they didn't do was ask, genuinely ask, without agenda, without already having decided what the answer would be. And I carry some responsibility for that too. I kept my distance. I told myself it was the security clearances, the paperwork, the things I couldn't say. And that was true, but some of it was simpler than that. I didn't trust them enough to try. What I've learned, slowly and not always gracefully, is that integrity isn't just about what you do when people are watching. It's about what you do when they've already made up their minds about you. It's about not becoming the version of yourself that they've decided you are. My family called me absent, and I had a choice. I could spend years proving them wrong in ways they could see, or I could just keep doing the work that mattered, quietly, and let the truth be what it was. That's not passive. That's a decision. It takes something out of you to make it. The intelligence part, the knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, that's something I had to learn the hard way. I used to think that explaining myself would fix things, that if I just found the right words, the right moment, the right amount of detail, people would understand. But there's a kind of clarity that only comes from watching your own restraint work better than any argument could have. Frances didn't call a single witness. She handed up one folder. That was enough. I learned more about strategy in that courtroom than in years of trying to manage other people's perceptions. And the endurance. That's the one that doesn't get talked about enough. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that shows up in stories where someone overcomes something in a single scene. The quiet, grinding kind. The 14-hour drive in February. The years of shelling up to work that no one in your family knew about. The phone calls you don't make because you don't know what to say, and you don't have the energy to navigate it. The way you just keep going anyway, not because it's noble, but because there isn't another option you can live with. My dad left me 42 acres with a creek along the back edge. I think he knew, in whatever way he understood my life, that I would need a place that was just mine. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere that didn't require explanation. I'm still figuring out what to do with it. But I know I'm going to keep it.